Today, we are diving into a huge moment in history that, chances are, you might not know by its real name. We're talking about a massive anti-colonial uprising in Nigeria back in 1929, and it was led entirely by women. But the name history has often given this event? Well, that's where our story really begins. You see, official British records and a lot of history books since have labeled this the ABBA Women's Riot. But the word riot, it suggests chaos, right? Something disorganized, maybe even mindless. So the big question we're going to tackle is, does that label even remotely fit the facts? Or was this something much, much bigger? To really get why tens of thousands of women suddenly rose up, we have to look at the world they were living in. We need to see how a new colonial system didn't just try to govern their world. It threatened to completely shatter it. Okay, so the British strategy in Nigeria was something called indirect rule. On paper, the idea was to govern through existing local leaders. The problem was they didn't really understand the local structures, especially for the Igbo people where power was way more spread out and communal than what the British were used to. So the British just invented a new position, the warrant chief. These guys were handpicked by the colonial administration, creating this brand new chain of command. Suddenly, these chiefs didn't answer to their own people. They answered to the British district officer. And this whole rigid setup completely bulldozed the vital roles that women had always held in their communities. And this is absolutely crucial to understand. Before the British showed up, Igbo women were not powerless, not even close. They had their own powerful councils, they were central to village decisions, and, this is key, they controlled the local markets and trade. They had real, tangible economic and political clout. And then came the final straw. The warrant chiefs, following British orders, started slapping on new fees. And then, rumors started flying that a direct tax on women was coming. This was a direct assault on their livelihood, especially the palm oil trade, which was literally the backbone of their economic independence. Their entire way of life was on the line.
So, what happened next wasn't chaos. It wasn't a riot. It was a calculated, coordinated, and unbelievably fast mobilization. The women decided it was time to fight back.
It all started with one woman, Nwanyerua, who flat out refused to be counted for a tax. And her single act of defiance lit a fuse. The movement spread with incredible speed. In less than a month, one confrontation exploded into a massive protest across the entire region. This wasn't some random flare-up. This was a fire spreading with purpose. And the scale of it is just staggering. We're talking about more than 50,000 women mobilized across 6,000 square miles. I mean, just let that sink in. This is 1929. There's no internet, no phones. That level of coordination is astounding. That number alone just blows the whole riot label out of the water. So how in the world did they pull it off? Well, it was brilliant. They used their existing market networks, the very thing they were fighting to protect, as a kind of superhighway for communication. A palm leaf sent from one market to the next was a recognized symbol, a call to action. This was so far from a spontaneous mob, it was a sophisticated network with coordinated protests and a very clear set of political demands. They also used this powerful, traditional form of protest called sitting on a man. Now, this wasn't violent. It was a method of public shaming and social pressure. Women would gather at the home of a warrant chief or a colonial official, and they would sing and dance, detailing all his wrongdoings, and they would not leave until he caved. It was targeted, it was cultural, and it was incredibly effective. The British, however, didn't see any of this as a legitimate protest. They saw it as a threat to their power, a challenge to their authority, and their response was swift and absolutely brutal. Now, I want you to pay close attention to these next two numbers. Throughout this entire uprising, with tens of thousands of women protesting for weeks, the number of British colonial officials who were killed was exactly 0. The women's tactics were about pressure, not bloodshed. And now, for the other side of that coin. In stark, tragic contrast, colonial police and troops opened fire on the protesting women. Over 50 were killed, and many, many more were injured. The violence in this conflict was overwhelmingly, terrifyingly one-sided. But here's the incredible part. Despite that horrific cost, the women won. I mean, just look at the scorecard. They demanded an end to the tax on women, and they got it. They demanded the removal of the warrant chiefs, and the British were forced to get rid of the entire system. They demanded a return to traditional governance, and yep, reforms were made to include women. This wasn't a failed riot. This was a political victory. So this brings us full circle, right back to where we started. We've seen the context, the organization, the goals, and the results. So now let's talk about that name and why it matters so much. To call this a riot is to accept the colonial story, the one that dismisses it all as mindless chaos. But everything we've seen points to something completely different. It was a war, a political struggle fought with clear strategic goals, incredible organization, and non-negotiable demands. This wasn't just some minor disturbance, it was a major anti-colonial movement. And hey, it's not just me saying this. Historians who've really dug into this event, they don't call it a riot. They know exactly what it was. This quote here says it all. This was one of the most significant revolts in the history of British Africa. Period. So here's the bottom line. Calling it a riot robs these 50,000 women of their intelligence, their strategy, and their incredible political victory. But calling it the Women's War, that restores their agency. It acknowledges the true nature of their struggle. The language we choose to tell these stories really matters. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. When we see protests and social movements happening today, how do the words used by the media or by people in power, words like riot, protest, uprising, how do those words shape how we understand what's really going on? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this one.